we talk about floods, we should also talk about flood forecasting and warnings. It is extremely important to make sure that the people in certain areas that are prone to floods know when a flood is going to come, and they need to be warned if a flood is on its way. So how do we prove flood warnings? Now, improvements to estimates on rainfall and snowpack melt might also help us forecast and warn people about floods. Better gauging of rivers, the mapping of certain channels, and collection of weather data is also going to be a huge improvement. Better and current information about human populations and infrastructure. So if we know how many people live in an area, the infrastructure in the particular area, this might help people forecast and warn better. The elevation and stream channels need to be added to flood risk assessment models. Now, a lot of times the elevation of certain areas and the stream channels, the elevation of those stream channels or the rivers, are not added to flood risk assessment models. Better sharing of information between forecasters, national agencies, relief organizations, and general public. Oftentimes what happens is that we have all these little people, all these bits of people taking lots of information. However, nobody really shares that information with other people, so that information is not relayed back and forth. More complete and timely sharing of information of weather and water information is needed among countries within international drainage basins. So imagine living in Europe or living in Asia. It's not always where the water basins or these drainage basins are in one particular country. Sometimes we have these drainage basins that cross boundaries into different countries. So on one side, we might see a country really focused on their water basin and know all this information. However, on the other side, in that same water basin in a different country, however, the information might not be shared. And this information is not shared between countries as well. So complete and timely information is needed in order to forecast and warn people about floods. And perhaps technology should be shared among all agencies involved in flood forecasting and risk assessment. So if we think about lots of places that have it, they might not have the available technology that some places do. Now it's extremely important for all people involved in flood forecasting and warning understand and know when certain information should be shared with the public. This is one of the reasons why flood forecasting and warnings are not the same everywhere. Now let's talk a little bit about flood prevention, amelioration, and management of floods. Now preventing floods, that basically means that we take measures in order to stop the flood from happening. It's almost like a proactive approach. Amelioration is to, basically that word means to improve upon something, the improvement. So perhaps in an area that floods a lot, perhaps we want to make it an improved area. We want to fix it so maybe the flood doesn't affect so many people. And then of course the management of floods. If there's really nothing that we can do about it, well, we have to manage it somehow. So let's talk about some of these ways that certain countries and places do. The first couple management options we have is something called hard engineering. Now, hard engineering techniques, these have greater impact on the river and the environment, and they tend to be a little bit more expensive. So when we talk about dam construction, we're talking about hard engineering techniques. Another hard engineering technique is a flood diversion. Now, these are measures taken to change or modify river channels. Sometimes creation of levees, perhaps enlarging the channel, or creating reservoirs in certain areas are methods of flood diversion. Now, once again in your textbook, on page 21, they have a variety of different methods that show you differences in flood diversion. Sometimes it might be taking the river channel and completely taking it in one different direction. Sometimes we might enlarge the channel so more water can flow into a certain area. Sometimes we take, perhaps we'll take a water and divert it around a city instead of through a city or an environment. Sometimes dams are involved. And then also, it's possible that pumps and sluices are put into particular areas, which will pump the water out into different areas. So these are hard engineering techniques, and like I said, they are a little bit more expensive, and they do have a greater impact on the river and the environment in which they reside. So because of this, there are other techniques that might be used in order to manage floods, and these are called soft engineering techniques. Now these are more sensitive to the environment, and they tend not to, or they try not to, develop the environment or change it in any way. One of the soft engineering techniques is something called flood abatement, and this is where this decreases the amount of runoff, and this reduces the flood peak in a drainage basin. So if we can reduce the amount of runoff that comes off of these floods, perhaps by reforestation, putting more of the vegetation back into certain areas, reseeding sparsely vegetated areas, we want to make them grow larger. Perhaps clear off some of the sediment from the headwater streams, so kind of as close to the beginning as you possibly can, clearing away some of that sediment, which will allow more water to flow in certain areas. And then, of course, preservation of natural water storage areas. Now, these are all soft engineering techniques that are a little bit less invasive on the environment, and sometimes they can be expensive, like reforestation. That can be very expensive. But these are techniques that are used to not to impact the environment as much. Now, in certain areas where they are prone to flooding, there's this idea called loss sharing. Now, loss sharing is a flood protection adjustment. It's kind of like insurance, except everybody in this particular area sort of puts in money into a big pot, and then when they need the money, they are able to pull out of the pot. Disaster aid is another loss sharing technique. So any aid, such as money or equipment, staff, technical assistance, can be given to a community following a flood or some sort of disaster. Now, when talking about housing, it's important to sort of make these hazard-resistant designs. Basically, we flood-proof them. You block up the entrances, you seal doors, you remove damageable goods, and you put them into higher levels, and you use sandbags around entrances as well. And as you see here in the picture with the house, this house is built on stilts. So if a flood does happen, then the water just sort of goes underneath the house, and it really won't affect the house at all unless the river gets too big. But this is part of that hazard-resistant design, and it's really there so it has less impact on the environment. The people living in this house live with the flood. They know it's going to happen, so they are proactive in preventing it.